Welcome. My name is Beth Marsh, and I am the Director of Membership and Stakeholder Engagement for the Organization of American Historians. Our webinar this evening, The Union Remade, U.S. History at 250, is part of our Future of the Past webinar series, which explores our diverse history to inform our future, and it is the fourth installment of our U.S. History at 250 series, a 9-installment arc that will culminate at the 2026 OAH Conference on American History in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The organization is the largest professional society dedicated to the teaching and study of American history. The mission of the organization is to promote excellence in the scholarship, teaching, and presentation of American history, and to encourage wide discussion of historical questions and the equitable treatment of all practitioners of history. The Organization of American Historians is located on the campus of Indiana University, Bloomington. We wish to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University, Bloomington is built on indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. It is my pleasure to introduce our host this evening, Steve Andrews. Steve is the executive editor at the Journal of American History and an adjunct professor of history at Indiana University. He is also an editor at Process, a blog for American history, and is the consulting editor of The American Historian. His work and teaching focuses on the cultural and religious history of the United States, and he has taught classes on religion, reform, and the Civil War. He is deeply engaged in public history, appearing in the media to discuss the history of conspiracy theories, and working closely with the 9/11 Museum in New York City to help educators address conspiracy theories in the classroom. Steve, I will now turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. Joining us tonight is a great group of scholars who've made a really fantastic issue in this Union Remade. The first is Melissa DeVelvis, is an assistant professor of history at Augusta University in Augusta, Georgia. Her book, Gendering Secession, White Women in Politics in South Carolina, 1859 to 1861, will be published by Cambridge University Press in 2025. We're also joined by Hannah Katherine Hicks, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the Richard Civil War Era Center at the Pennsylvania State University and earned her PhD in history from Vanderbilt University. Her current book project focuses on women in the criminal courts in post-Civil War South Carolina. Her work on women, law, and medicine has appeared in Women's History Review and the Bulletin of the History of Medicine. Catherine A. Jones is associate professor in history at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is the author of Intimate Reconstructions, Children in Post-Emancipation Virginia, published by the University of Virginia Press in 2015, and is currently working on a book project related to the incarceration of children after emancipation in the American South. Ashleigh Lawrence-Sanders is an assistant professor of African American history and U.S. history at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research and teaching interests include Black radicalism, Black women's history, as well as Civil War and Reconstruction memory. She is currently working on a first book project, A History of African American Civil War Memory. Thank you all so much for joining us. This issue has been, I think, one, it was enjoyable to put together. I think it's really come across as something that I'm going to use in my own classrooms, and I think and the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, of all the things I teach, there's a kind of an interesting disjuncture. It's one of the few kinds of classes that I teach, and I'd love to know if you guys have the similar experience, where many students come in either knowing quite a bit or thinking they know quite a bit about the subject, which isn't always true when I teach religious history and other things. And there's a disjuncture from what they know and the full story that we want to discuss about the Civil War. But there's also a huge drop-off where even people who are very engaged in the Civil War don't have the same knowledge about Reconstruction. And I don't know if that the same experience that you've had, and if so, how do we explain this? Because so much of this issue really seems to be about memory. Anybody?
Well, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Because I teach U.S. history, the second half and I teach both halves of African American history. And both halves of my African American history class, I get Reconstruction in. I get a little bit in to the class that ends in 1865 because I'm like, look, we need to talk about what this moment of emancipation and freedom looks like. But of course, I really get into in my AFAM 2 class, which I'm teaching this semester. And I always ask this question of students, like, what do you learn about Reconstruction? I'm really into like asking my students of what they learned already before they come to the classroom. And hands down, you're right. They will say that they have learned a bit about Reconstruction. And then, they're always surprised. And I think it's a good thing to surprise them about all the depths of the topic. I think part of it is that they learn a lot about the political processes of it, right? They learn about maybe the impeachment of Johnson or, they learn about the amendments somewhat. But they don't really ever really learn as much about what life was like for African Americans transitioning from enslavement to freedom. I use resources to try to get them to think through what do Black people need in this moment? And how is the federal government responding or not responding to this? How are state and local governments responding? So they get a bit of the political history, but really the social history of what African Americans and newly freed people are like. And I don't think they're able to get that in most K through 12 settings because of just, the pressure, et cetera, what some of the courses are covering during that time. And it's complicated. It's a complicated, complex time where the country doesn't come out looking great at the end of it. And no section, North or South, comes out looking great, I would add. So
yeah. I know your question was about maybe teaching history, maybe majors, because I'm actually currently teaching my Civil War and Reconstruction class right now. But I do just want this to be a plea. If any of you on this call are in charge of deciding when your history class ends, please move that 65 to 76 if you can. I hate when the survey, because I teach both halves. I've been doing the first half for a while now, but that's just because of our whoever was teaching. I can do both. But yeah, ending in 1876 is so much better for viewing it as a process and not just the war was over and the slaves were freed. The end, we did it. And again, I don't think there's any necessarily malicious intent on the fact of K-12 kind of wanting to celebrate the end of a war and celebrate emancipation. But yeah, I will say though, when you do end in 76, it is such a downer. It's the end of the semester. And I'm ending on, because I'm right across the river from the Hamburg Massacre of 1876 in South Carolina and the Compromise. And then I'm ending on what's happening out west. And it's real just kind of like, sorry, guys. But though it is, like you mentioned, a hard topic to teach, yeah, if y'all teach the survey, even if it says end in 1865, maybe we could cheat that a little bit. And so people get it on both ends would be really great. That's my personal plea. I'm going to start with that.
I love that. And I completely agree. I mean, there is this, I think to pick up points that both of you made, the complexity is a challenge, as is, I think, the affective experience of teaching it. What it is, you don't get resolution, you get a really mixed story. But I think also that's really, in some ways, I think what our students need right now. I have one heartening story. I'm also teaching my Civil War era class, and in my mid-quarter feedback, I asked students what are things that they were hoping to learn about that we haven't gotten to, and the most frequent answer was Reconstruction. So there's a sense that students have that their understanding of this period is really incomplete without having a better understanding of the period. So I was really heartened by the sense that there's that desire, but I think that challenge of kind of how to balance the sense of what Reconstruction accomplished, not just through its legislative outcomes, but through the incredible courage and activism that goes on long after 1876, that I think some of these articles point to and give us some ways to kind of drop into narratives and individual lives that help us illustrate that, with also kind of wrestling with facts. This story looks really different and unsatisfying, and in some ways discouraging, depending where we're looking. So I think it is a challenge, but I think students are really eager to kind of engage those questions, because I think it reflects a lot of the questions they bring to the world they inhabit right now. So tricky as it is, I agree. I think it's really worthwhile, and I think there's a desire there.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone else has said about the complexities of teaching Reconstruction. I've also taught both halves of the of the survey, the local complexities, like it looks different. Reconstruction looks different depending on where you're talking about in the North, the South, the West, even different parts of the South. You know, Georgia during Reconstruction is not South Carolina. I loved Ashleigh's piece about the Kanawha Massacre and Melissa's comment about the Hamburg Massacre, maybe like looking at the local in Reconstruction as a way of helping students orient themselves. I used to teach at North Carolina High School, and we lived not far from where Hiram Rhodes Rebels had lived, even though he actually became a senator for Mississippi. And so students thought that was neat and bringing in some of that local history. I think another thing that's challenging for students is a lot of people, not just students, but like to think that progress is really linear. Or that maybe there was never going to be any progress at all, and the possibility was foreclosed from the beginning. That's the more recent reaction or assumption I've seen students making. And so it's hard to kind of wrestle with, you know, there can be progress and there can be reversals in the contingencies of history. So that's one reason why I think Reconstruction can be tough, although very important to teach.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things my students have, and maybe your students, the ones that you're sitting with now, have the same problem, which is in the Reconstruction period. I mean, I think it's true in every historical period, but it's so clear in Reconstruction of the disjuncture between the laws that are coming out of Washington, and that we tend to, maybe it's part of our era of federal supremacy we've been in post-World War II, but we tend to think that laws mean things. And then the reality that the 13th Amendment, which Lincoln and the people who were the lame duck, representatives worked so hard to get through, happens, and an unbelievably important piece of legislation that occurs. And yet then my students are stunned when there's large sections of Alabama or Mississippi in which slavery kind of continues, sometimes in another name, sometimes in another form. And I think our students, like you said, Hannah, kind of whipsaw between, now that the laws are passed, that changes everything, and it doesn't. Or now that the laws are passed and it doesn't change anything, the laws don't matter at all. So this kind of sense of like, either I don't know why this is happening when it's illegal, or absolutely nihilism that none of this mattered at all. I mean, are you guys running into the same? That disjuncture is so clear in the Reconstruction period in a way that students have a very difficult time managing.
I see that a lot, actually. I had done Reconstruction a few weeks ago, and had them read parts of Kadada Williams's most recent book. And so many times when reading that or other things, my students were like, "Well, what about the 14th Amendment? Where was the federal government?" Was what they would say while actually like reading this. And I was like, the federal government at this point, like we were talking about 18, they are like, easing out of any sort of like direct confrontation. And so having them understand why we eventually get to Jim Crow, like how these things are allowed to happen. I was like, well, let's look a little bit of future casting about what the South becomes, right? It does not become this overnight. And it becomes this way because people literally get around and we get a Supreme Court that, justifies like some of the things that happen. So in as much as federal power is working during Reconstruction, my students do have this kind of like, wait, what about this amendment that was just passed? Where is the federal government when these people are what happens to people who perpetrated this violence? And it's hard to just be like, well, nothing, and to not get that kind of response to them where they're just rejecting the impact of laws completely, right, on these people. Because, I think Kadada Williams does well is actually show that these people cared about the fact that laws existed and tried to use the system as much as they could, even when it was no longer going to be efficient for them. So, yeah, I get that whiplash a lot when students are like, well, this is crazy. Where's the federal government? I was like, the federal government is not caring. That's where they are. So, I mean, it's hard, I think, for them to think about that.
Absolutely. Actually, I had that same response from my students when we were talking about the Colfax massacre and Louisiana, and then the Cruikshank Supreme Court decision, where they're like, how can they just, basically like weaken the 14th Amendment like this? It's just, it's that difference between like actually passing the law and that law being held up, and then the court's power, and then the enforcement on the ground.
Yeah, it's especially frustrating, like when you look at Colfax and things like this for students, and we haven't hit Reconstruction yet this semester. And not to be, well, actually, no, to be presentist, I'm very interested to see how they feel about um, laws and enforcement or the lack thereof. Um, but like we have hundreds of pages of testimony, congressional testimony from Hamburg, and then nothing happened. Well, no, actually something happened. They were like, we have the names of the people who were like charged for these things, and then nothing happened. And so I'm interested and braced to kind of see what comes out of that. And not to just make this like a Kadada Williams fan club. For those who haven't read it, it's I Saw Death Coming. Take a bubble bath in between each chapter because this is about the Klan raids and the Klan trials. But what she does and what I'm going to try and lean on is that like these people knowing that the law isn't really on their side in enforcement anymore. They still stand and bear witness and bear testimony. And that's one of the strengths that she finds in this and why we should care. And why we also shouldn't shy away from the terrible things that are happening or gloss it over or anything like that. But yeah, just they knew that nothing would happen and yet they did it anyway. And I think that's how I fight my nihilism when it really starts to overwhelm me personally.
Yeah, and I think no, I completely agree, and I think that's I mean, in some ways, I think one of the things that's really valuable about getting to teach courses around the Civil War era, I think thinking about the long history of abolition and the long history of emancipation, if you think about the Reconstruction as an episode in that much longer history where there are many reversals and there are diverse tactics for trying to resist, whether that is just bearing witness, whether that is using the courts to exact some civil protections in unlikely places, and so I think that in this moment it can be very obviously hard and confronting to read, and I think sometimes students do kind of slide into a sense of nothing changes, nothing can ever change. But I think that in some ways this is in the larger sweep, it's a real opportunity to think about how people over time shift the terrain of struggle, but and retain this kind of repertoire that keeps coming back into play across as that terrain changes. And so I think in some ways it feels like when it can sometimes feel like we're trying to orient ourselves in our own historical moment and where we are in stories of change, I find myself comforted to also think about this was a really long history getting to this point, and the sense of the people who are living in it understanding that as much triumph as there was around the 14th Amendment, for example, no one, I think, on the ground really expected this to be the end of the story. And I think that can actually be that can be in some ways an encouraging story when we feel disoriented ourselves. So.
Yeah.
I mean, I think sometimes it's not even about intent. It's right. It's just about even if the federal government wants to do something, even right at the end of the war, when you still have a lot of troops in the field, the ability of being able to change what someone in rural Alabama, far from the front, far from any troops do, whatever the law is just hard to imagine. And that points to something else that comes out in these pieces, which is, I think even as someone who has taught this for decades, a lack of ability to appreciate the degree of change that happens between 1860 and 1870. I'm not sure there's another period of American history that's like it, where you sit on a place and you think the world in 5 or 8 years is going to be so utterly, unbelievably different that no one at the beginning of that period can imagine what it would be like on the other end. I mean, 40 to 48 isn't as big. I mean, there's very few times that are as big. That the changes that happen through Reconstruction are in 1868 are unimaginable in 1864, not even 1861. And I think it's hard to find a way to give that to my students because they have a sense of how it goes. I mean, how do you capture the unbelievable contingency and change of, I mean, Lincoln is not in 1864 where the Republicans are going to be in 1870. Like it's hard to grasp and communicate that degree of change to students. I mean, I haven't found a way to do it. Have you guys found a way to communicate that in a way that kind of registers with students?
Well, we can ask them the first or the last time we had a new constitutional amendment.
Yeah, right.
They won't know, but just to think about that, like there were three. There were three in that period of time. So that's one way to show just the amount of change where today, I think increasingly we're like, oh yeah, that's the Constitution. It doesn't change, it's the Constitution. It's like, no, we amended it and it ratified. And one of my, I also look at the in my different classes, the Equal Rights Amendment. And so that's a whole different story of how hard ratification can be. I also like to show them, used to teach in South Carolina, and now I'm like, what, 5 miles on the other side of the river. So I steal from South Carolina a little bit because Georgia's Reconstruction ended early, but in my opinion, early. But there was more Black representation in their state Congress proportional to their population demographics than there has ever been since. And I think that, and I teach a lot of like pre-med people who are, for the survey, under duress taking my class. It's fine. I just imagine me taking a biology class. But sometimes just putting the stats on the board, and we can talk more about like what it means to just put information on the board rather than us leading them there. But yeah, just to show them that these are big political changes that we couldn't imagine today happening today.
To add to that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ashleigh. Sorry. I was just going to say, I think one of the other tools that I think that the amendments is really powerful in giving them some of the data, but I think biography is really a powerful tool. I mean, I was thinking about that in the pieces in that or in the issue. I was thinking of Dr. Hicks's piece, thinking about Susie King Taylor and thinking about her life as being able to kind of illustrate the breadth of change, and also the way the struggle isn't over even after Reconstruction, and how that fight continues. Or I know my students have really responded to the story of Robert Smalls, and thinking about just the tremendous biography and the thrill and the representation of that story, but also the long afterlife of that. So I think biography can also be a powerful way to kind of illustrate the amount of change and also people's adaptability. But I'm sorry for interrupting you. Please go ahead.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah, I was thinking too, just to build off of that, I think you're absolutely right. Biography and showing just within the lives of people how things have changed. I think one of the things I do in both half of my classes is I use that Jordan Anderson letter.
Yes.
And, where he's like, a letter to my former master, which, students really enjoy reading that letter, the tone of it and everything, but also just like giving them the time frame that Jordan Anderson has only been free for maybe a year. This letter is 1865. And, I have this question for them beginning, what do Black people need now that they're free? And they'll say housing, jobs, security, safety, all these things, right? Things human beings need, right? And I say, okay, what has Jordan Anderson found in freedom in the short amount of time he's been living in Ohio and Dayton, right? Like, he has found these things. His kids are in school. His wife gets respect. He's safe. He has a paying job. All these things he did not have as an enslaved person. So they get this idea that, yes, like what freedom actually means to people. And then, yeah, we go through these massive changes that happen. Like, the literacy rate of African Americans jumps tremendously by the time we get to the 1880s, right? The establishment of schools, Black colleges, Black churches are, even more robust, Black social organizations, like, what it means, to actually be able to work for yourself, right? And how that's seen as a danger, right? So by the time we get to the 1890s and we see the reestablishment of Jim Crow, and I'm like, well, what are people trying to reestablish? What were people fighting for during this time period? To see how people's individual lives have changed, right? The social hierarchy is different during Reconstruction, and that's why there's such a desperate need to dismantle it. But also what people are able to have in their lives, like just to, be able to marry legally for the first time. I think that that's such an important thing that people don't even think about. Like, children working or not working, right? The decision for children to maybe not work, these are very like small things you think about, but large things to the people who are experiencing them. And this changes within months or even like maybe a year or two in most of these people's lives. And it's tremendous social revolution, I would say, of 4 million people.
Absolutely. And there's some wonderful books, as our panelists probably know, that speak to these kind of small freedoms, as Devoya Glimp has called them, and some great primary sources. One of them I read recently was I Can't Wait to Call You My Wife by Rita Roberts. And it's just this beautiful, wonderful collection of often short letters that freed people wrote to their family members, some people born free before the war as well. And I think students would just love the photographs of like Black Union soldiers and their families and these letters and the way they're presented, as well as some of Tara Hunter's work about marriage, to Ashleigh's point, and what it meant for people to be able to reconstitute their families.
I mean, I think another question about is that of where we think that of how Civil War classes, I think, have changed, certainly have changed since I took them way long ago myself, is the incorporation of the West. Have you, I mean, is that now seems to be part of the Civil War story we tell? And how do you relate to either students or in your own work? How does it relate to, how does it allow us to see the West in a new way?
I mean, I'll go. I mean, because I think that, of course I teach in Colorado. So I think students are very much interested in like, oh, how do the first group of Black people get to Colorado? Or what is happening during the Civil War and during Reconstruction in the West? And I said, it all is interconnected when I teach the US survey, right? Like what is going on in the East around Reconstruction has direct effects on what, the westward expansion that's happening. In fact, in the first half of FM, we talk about how westward expansion is intimately tied to the expansion of slavery, and what that looks like, dispossession of Native people from their lands in this area. So when we get to like, this Reconstruction era, and we're talking about what's happening, everything is happening in the West at the same time, is what I tell my students. I was like, we get focused so on Reconstruction and what's happening in DC and the national amendments, but you can't actually separate the two. This is a country that's trying to expand geographically and economically way out west, while also trying to deal with the problems of reconstructing, the South and, making, quote unquote, remaking the nation at the same time. The nation is being remade on the backs of a lot that's, a lot of violence and dispossession out west at the same time. So, one thing I talk about is what Black people find when they move out west, like this first sort of round of Black people who move and homesteaders, et cetera, as a way of talking about African-American history class about what the West looks like during this time period. But also like how we can't divorce what the national government is doing, from what their policies are out west. And even like, talk about Black Buffalo Soldiers and the complicated legacy, as I like to say, of Buffalo Soldiers and what they're involved in the West, which students are a little bit surprised to hear about because they hear about Buffalo Soldiers, these heroic figures. And I was like, it's complicated, right? It's complicated when you consider what they're doing out West. So I think it has to kind of be a part of the story. And I think, still understudied, I think. I think the more, there's the great books that are getting more into the Civil War in the West, more in the Reconstruction in the West, but I think still more to be told about how these things are intimately connected to each other.
Yeah, first reading Megan Kate Nelson's The Civil War from Apache Pass changed the way I viewed the war, truly. And just like even thinking about the West and also like Indigenous involvement, I have to remind myself sometimes that the Homestead Act right smack dab in the middle of the Civil War, but also the mass execution of the Dakota right smack dab in the middle of the Civil War. When you teach the Civil War from military history perspective, which I do sometimes, speaking of the Buffalo Soldiers, these same soldiers like Sherman and Sheridan and all of these people who are like the U.S. Army heroes end up becoming, well, my students go, wait, they're the baddies now?
Yeah.
Like when you look at who are the names of the people who are fighting the quote Indian Wars, which is so reductive, but the U.S. Army presence in the 1860s and 70s, like they are the names that we're familiar with. So there is a like continuous line. In a survey class, I would love for someone to shoot me an email and tell me how you do all of those conflicts at the end of the semester during Reconstruction in like 3 lectures. Please tell me how, because I feel like I'm not doing it justice. But yeah, from a military perspective, it's a continuous line. Speaking of progress, I guess like it's the same names. It's a wild way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I certainly had the experience of that kind of transition from when I was in graduate school and on the East Coast. Really was thinking about the Civil War as an Eastern story, and moving to California and teaching California students helped guide me towards really pursuing that literature that has, as the fellow panelists have mentioned, has really grown and in really accessible ways. So I certainly find I teach my Civil War class a lot differently. And I think the incorporation of more Indigenous history feels like one of the things that students are really eager for. And also, I mean, back to our initial conversation about the complexity of Reconstruction, you know, the federal government that feels like a champion and a bulwark of some of the possibilities of equality has a very different appearance when you're talking about the Ho-Chunk removal. So I think in some ways, again, there can be a bit of whiplash, but I think there's also it's such a compelling way into thinking about how is federal power experienced on the ground and by whom. And I think the Western part of that story compels us to recognize that an expanding federal government can cut in multiple directions. And so that's one of those things I find myself grateful to my students and other scholars for making it easier to incorporate that work.
And I think it's like, would the growing power of the federal government that emerges through the 1860s and into the 1870s as a much stronger force has a much heavier hand in the West than might have been applied otherwise. And when you think of the people who are in the West doing the things, you know, that Melissa's talking about, these kinds of the attacks on various Plains Indians and other things, these are people who've gone through Shiloh and Antietam and Gettysburg. And is their attitude towards violence, towards cruelty, towards what is acceptable use of force against civilians changed from having gone through that? And that experience in the West is the people who are going through that at the point that we're talking in the 1870s are people who may have seen and done some things that had truly changed their outlook towards applicable violence in the 10 years previously. And how does that change the course of the West? More powerful and more casual. I mean, I'm not sure, you know, I don't think that my lectures quite bring that in because they come in the middle of Reconstruction, and it's important to talk about Dawes Act and things like this. But I don't think it's hard to fully grasp the question of that the army that goes west following the Civil War is a different army than even that had been there in the 1840s and 50s during the Mexican War and other places of dislocation. I mean, it's a different war with a different army with a different set of experiences that probably conditioned the way that handled the West and acted in the West. But you know, one of the things that comes out that I think we talked about earlier is that the difficulty about Reconstruction is, you know, taking in that it's small stories. We get, you know, I mean, as Melissa's kind of said several times, like Georgia's different than South Carolina. 5 miles makes a big difference in the political process. And I think some of these pieces, talking about Susie King Taylor or talking about the Cainhoy Massacre, like that these are local events that have to be seen in a local way. And those two articles in particular, how do you see that you can connect these kinds of individual lives or local events to these kind of bigger stories of Reconstruction in the Civil War? How does that?
Well, for the Susie King Taylor piece, which was my piece, and of course it was more generally about Black women during the Civil War and Reconstruction, I had been reading and teaching her memoir, and so it was something that I felt like readers could kind of latch onto, because this is a broad topic, Black women during the Civil War and Reconstruction, and there's been so much amazing scholarship. So I had kind of the challenge of trying to like give an overview of some of that history and some of that scholarship, but also giving this personal story of Susie King Taylor. And one of the things that struck me about her reminiscence was she publishes in 1902. So she publishes almost 40 years after the Civil War. Yes, she's telling her own personal story of having been an enslaved woman, really a girl. She's only about 14 when she comes to Union lines and becomes a nurse and a laundress and the wife of a Black Union soldier. But she's also reflecting on historical changes in her reminiscence. She's talking about some of the myths and about historical memory that were already emerging, that she'd seen emerging during her lifetime, that kind of reconciliationist view of the Civil War in the North and the South. She'd seen groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy protesting against plays that they said exaggerated the cruelty of slavery. Even in her lifetime, she'd lived slavery and she'd already seen those politics. And so she speaks a lot to that collective memory and remembering and forgetting about the war. So I feel like she's very much this is very much not just kind of like a siloed story, like this is what women or what Black women were doing over here, but this gives you a fuller picture of the overall story of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and that kind of nebulous period between Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And of course, she was writing during Jim Crow.
Yeah, see, I've got a bit of a cheat code here that maybe they don't in, like, California, or maybe Colorado, in that, well, I'm in Augusta, and we actually, a lot of our Civil War era stuff remains because Sherman didn't go through Augusta. And but who did go through was the 33rd, speaking of Susie King Taylor. And so and we're right across the street from where Prince Rivers set up Hamburg. And so it's very easy for me, selfishly, to go through and make these connections to both the Civil War, because we've got Confederate generals too. We've got Ella Gertrude Clanton Thomas, who has several series of diaries. She's quoted a lot. Who was living in Augusta with her plantation and complaining about how labor changed after Reconstruction. And so I can literally point to her because she talks about the war, and then she talks about the reconstruction of labor afterwards. But just a quick, so one of my side gig right now that the book is done, is to have more Reconstruction history on the public landscape in Augusta, because despite that, we have one of the tallest Confederate monuments from the period, and there's no Reconstruction really memory there, though the Black History Museum does a great job, but they don't tie it to Reconstruction so much as these are Black educators or these are Black ministers. So I can tie to a lot of really local events and make them big. But just a funny anecdote, Washington Post is Made by History series. I was writing with my colleague DJ Polite about how Ted Cruz had said that the Compromise of 1876 is what we should do after the election of 2020. And so I wrote a little piece about, hey, the Compromise of 1876 in South Carolina, not good. Tissue ballots together, shaken, made it look like one person voted a ton. More votes in Edgefield County and Barnwell County, South Carolina than was possible from the voting electorate. People following them with guns. Wade Hampton III's people surrounding South Carolina's State House trying to force Republican Chamberlain out. This is not a compromise. And so it was so convenient to point to. It's great for teaching, not for life, but that the gubernatorial election of 1876 with its voter fraud and intimidation and stuff happens at the same time as the quote end of Reconstruction, which of course we can debate if that's 1876 until our faces turn blue. But then 3 days before it's about to be published, January 6th happened.
Yeah.
So we had to add a couple lines about surrounding government buildings during an election.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so that made it very easy to make connections, both contemporary and to make the local really big.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, for me, one, I love the story of Susie King Taylor, of course, and I write about her quite a bit. A Georgia story, but I say also South Carolina story too, because she was in Beaufort for a good amount of time as
Port
well.
Royal forever.
Exactly. So I, love claiming her, and also, coastal Gullah Geechee descendant. And I think about this a lot when I was writing about the Kanehoy riot / Kanehoy massacre. It was personal to me because I grew up in that town. And, I'd always kind of heard very vague things about it growing up, right? Oh, something happened at that church over there. And, it was a battle like a bunch of years ago with guns, et cetera. And then I read about it, I think, as I say in the piece, in a really old history book that my dad had, really old Berkeley County history. Which was interesting in some parts, let's say that, where how it was written. But I think that one thing about that story, and just considering the the year-ish of violence in South Carolina leading up to the election of 1876, where, you know, you get the Hamburg Massacre, you get Ellington, you get these like devastating, you know, moments of where, you know, Black people, particularly in upstate areas, are just slaughtered, right? And this leads to, you know, what Melissa was just referring to, like a very, very faulty, let's say, and corrupt election of 1876. But we also get a very different story in the Low Country. Speaking of peculiarities, specificities of areas, the Low Country is just different. There is just Black people. It's the Black majority, as Peter Wood said ages ago. And there are tons, like the counties there are 80% Black. You know, Charleston County, Berkeley County, Beaufort County, you could look at the statistics. It's not really until 1920s, 1930s where they start to turn a bit, but heavily Black, and also Black people that people are afraid of is what I like to say, because they're heavily armed. You know, there's also something when I was reading the newspapers about the Kanehoe riot, there are the people being like those island Negroes. Mind you, Kanehoe is not technically on an island, but there's something about people from this region that make people particularly afraid. And you see why, because these are people who are ready to defend themselves. They're people who were enslaved mostly on the rice plantations out in the East Cooper. You know, they come from this background, they live on this land, some of them own the land. I'm descended from those people. But I also think about how like there're just a lot of anonymous Black people waging violence in this time period, right? Like you have the major Black leaders of the time. Some of them are Democrats. So you have Martin Delany and his really complicated "I'm a Democrat," you know, Democrat phase when he's supporting Wade Hampton. You know, he comes to speak at Kanehoe. And interestingly enough, I talk to my students when I talk about the violence, and I was like, people understood. And I often use some quotes from Stephen Hahn's A Nation Under Our Feet to talk about how Black people understood that in order to have political power, they needed to learn how to wield violence. That's a paraphrase of what he says. But when he's talking about, you know, Black militancy and, you know, Black units and, you know, all of this stuff about, you know, the Union League, he's saying, well, you know, they understood better than anyone else that violence would be necessary to wield power, you know, in the South. So I give them that and I say, why are Black people armed going into these political meetings? I was like, look at what's happened in the weeks before. This doesn't happen in Low Country, but you have Hamburg, you have Ellerton, you have these things that happen weeks before Kanehoe happens. So Black people have a fear of how this will turn out for them, and they are heavily armed. And you know, when all these meetings have just have guns anyway, and they're just the precautionary measures for them to go hide their guns, right? Of course, I talk about how the memory of it is so like melded into the politics of the time. But I think teaching students about why people were so willing to use violence and how the violence itself was talked about. And it gets into some of these complications because I think, you know, we want to talk about people being victims, but some people were refusing to be victims, even amidst the crazy amounts of violence you see in other parts of the state of South Carolina, the raids, you know, the massacres, et cetera. You have people who are like, we outnumber, we're going to do this. Black women and Black men, you know, out here armed with anything they can find to defend themselves, they think, in these political situations, because it's a desperate time, right? This is 1876, considering all that they had dealt with in the prior moments of Reconstruction. I think that's what makes South Carolina different, right? One of the things I show them is a map, like what's the free Black population? You know, what's the Black population in 1860 or 1870 in these Southern states? Now let's talk about why things happen differently in these states. Mississippi and South Carolina have really high Black populations. Louisiana does too, right? North Carolina a little bit less, Virginia a little bit less. Like we get less, where you see less, you see that this is like along lines. And even within these states, where are Black people, right? Where is Black power and Black political power in these places? I think that's how you get to some of these like really intricate local stories, but also a national story about how Reconstruction just does not happen the same way across the South.
I mean, so part of this story is also feels like, and what I'm teaching the story, and part of what these pieces talk about is the historical act of forgetting, which feels, you know, that we often think like, why do people not know as much about Reconstruction? You know, sometimes it's the way the classes are structured, either that Reconstruction comes at the end and you rush through, or Reconstruction comes at the beginning and someone wants to get to World War II, so they rush through. But I think the history of this period is that forgetting is as much of a purposeful act as remembering. And the things that are forgotten are really important. I mean, whether it's African American violence or it's, you know, Sherman's number, you know, Order 15 that sets off literally everything between Sawgrass and you know, like 7 PGA Tour stops are all going to be African American only. Like that kind of history. I mean, how do you, in your own classes, your own work, how do you address that forgetting as an act and not an accident? Is that something that you address as well, and how do you communicate that to students?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, there's one of those places I think the pieces in this issue speak to that it's intentional erasure rather than passive forgetting, as you suggest. And I think, I mean, I found that students are really responsive to kind of seeing how that is accomplished. I think Adam Dombey's book is a book that my students have really enjoyed because it's so systematic in talking about the multiple layers of falsification of the past and how it's an accumulation of lies that enable this big rewriting of history. And I think that's really instructive because I think it helps, I mean, it speaks to the power of historical research and that there are ways we can understand and find out more about how stories are built and why. And I think that's really empowering to students to think that there's a way you can tease apart the past. But I think that tying that to the memorial landscape is a really potent approach, because I think we've seen, you know, a lot of monuments taken down, but the process of replacing them, figuring out what is the story that we're going to tell, and recognizing it is contentious in many communities in an ongoing way. And I think that is also helps students appreciate why Reconstruction is both complex, but also why so many of the issues at its heart are still alive today. And so I think binding those things together, kind of being able to map out how false pasts are constructed, but also inviting them to think about, well, what would that look like as a different representation in the present, can be a really useful exercise.
Yeah, I think David Blight's essay actually speaks to that, and of course his larger work as well, like his book, Race and Reunion. And I've had students respond well to those pieces, as well as Karen Cox's scholarship about the UDC and like the recreation of Confederate memory and the lost cause myth and mythology. And then you can even look at like some present day, maybe documentaries about the Civil War. There's some that come to mind, but I won't maybe name them, which kind of skate over the issues of race and the emancipationist legacy and the legacy of Reconstruction and the fall of Reconstruction, in order to tell this war of a war between white brothers and reconciliation.
Yeah, Ashleigh unmuted before I did.
Oh. I was going to say just, yes, Adam Dombey, yes, Karen Cox's work. It's excellent for this. I also sometimes assign students Du Bois's Propaganda of History, which is the last chapter of Black Reconstruction, where like I tell my students, like, people don't really write like that anymore, where he just went after bit by bit every like, you know, white historian and the lies that they told, but also the stakes of it, right? Because while teaching history, especially to history majors, I want them to understand where historians sit in, you know, in the active act of erasure and forgetting, right? The historians have historically been part of this, right? The histories that were written and who were not allowed to write histories. And, you know, how these histories then get transmuted into popular culture. So we talk about Birth of a Nation, we talk about Gone with the Wind, we talk about all the like Westerns and stuff, you know, how we get a popular culture representation of this like erasure as well. I think students get in Du Bois's work too, like, you know, when Du Bois was writing this in the 1930s, what the stakes are then, but also like how impactful that scholarship was. And I think that, you know, some historians have continued to, you know, hammer on around the Dunning Study School, but even beyond the Dunning School, you know, Karen Cox, you know, and all this, the work that the UDC is doing at the state level in all of these states where they, you know, are in control or have connections with people who are running state archives, right? It really filters down from academic history to K-12 history and beyond. Why you don't know a thing? Well, they didn't want you to know. And in fact, they wrote histories to actively change the narrative around these things. So I think the role of history and historians in this, we not have played a passive role, right? Our discipline has not played a passive role in this as well.
Right. If you look at the Southern Historical Society, it's on purpose. Like there's a concentrated effort to, if we not sure we didn't win the war, we're not sure we won the peace, but we will win the memory war. And that's a third war going on. Sorry, Melissa.
Yeah, no, it's my piece even for this was stuff that most of us historians know. But just really, maybe it's because I'm in the trenches down in Augusta with a lot of people who still believe in the redeemers of that Reconstruction was actually to take the state back from these federal rule and quote Negro rule. And so like I'm still fighting this Reconstruction stuff on the ground with some people. And so I really just, and it's also that here at AU, I don't have grad students. So that's another thing that like we have really pushed, I've really pushed away from assigning books anymore. I'll assign excerpts of books, but really, really hitting hard with primary sources. Because especially in this, frankly, politicized period where students don't want to trust what you say just as like, oh, well, you have a PhD, therefore I believe it. Like you've got to back it up. You can't just like throw on like, I'm the authority figure teacher in the classroom anymore. And so I just, so that's why my piece was a little bit kind of more of an overview, but just linking to here are some sources you can find, because I just splat those on the board and I'm like, so what did South Carolina say secession was about? Instead of me telling you it's about slavery. But yeah, I assign propaganda of history. It's freely available online. When I Googled it, I assigned some of the textbooks from those periods because you can find little excerpts of them online. There's Mildred Codd Rutherford's A Measuring Rod for Textbooks, which tells them what kind of textbooks they should ban from schools. But yeah, no, it's very much like I have to put these sources up on the board because, and I think we saw some of that in the Q&A, that yeah, forgetting, not only forgetting could happen, but we are we've got to back it up. We've got to back up that we know what we're talking about, because in the classroom it's not enough to stand there and say this is what happened anymore.
We've had a few. One of the requests is we have name dropped so many different books and articles, and some of the people in the chat and who are watching this would like, I'm going to ask you guys if you could supply me with we could put together a bibliography of some of the things that we've cited that, whether in this conversation or you think would be useful, whether you've used it in class. I think a lot of people are talking about for classroom use as well. If you could send that to me, and we'll send it out to the people who have subscribed to this. There's some great questions. One is about how do you, when you are given that you have to talk about Reconstruction in only 3 or 4 lectures at the end of a class, how do you do it? And here's a question I want to do. I want to give the beginning of, just to get you to respond in our last couple of minutes, which is, in thinking about Kidada Williams' newest book, I Saw Death Coming, do you find yourselves reframing this historiographical mischaracterization of Reconstruction as a failure in your lectures? How do students understand these conversations? We know that there's both Black successes that produce a response. How do you talk about the success-failure narrative to complicate trends and transitions in the classroom? How do you discuss whether, Reconstruction is a failure? Is it a failure? I mean, there's some, I don't know. But so how do you guys respond to that question about, and Kidada Williams in particular, or however you want to take it?
I just ask students. The last slide I have is like, was Reconstruction a success or failure? That's the last slide I have. And I have some guiding questions for them, and they get into a discussion about it, what things they think they're a success, what things they think are failures. I think that a lot of students, because they already know, right, this is of course like, future thoughts about what happens in the South, they're more likely to say it's a failure. They're more likely to say that it failed to produce all these elements of freedom that we had discussed. But you do see students, that occasionally say, well, it did provide a legal infrastructure that's been incredibly important for our country. Because one of the things I talk about the constitutional amendments, I was like, 14th Amendment is probably the most important amendment we've had since the Bill of Rights. I don't know if that's, someone can debate me about that, but I think it's been important overall for our country because it has everything to say about due process of law, birthright, citizenship, all these things it establishes within a single amendment. And you have to zero in on that. but they'll talk about it, but they say that it ultimately has failed. But I do give them the open floor to say, hey, we've had this 2 weeks of conversation about this. What do you guys think about this?
Right.
I totally agree with Ashleigh to ask the question, turn the question back to the students based on what you've learned. In what ways do you think it was a success or a failure? And you'll always have people who are dead set one way or the other, and other people who are going to want to be more nuanced. But it's a great prompt for like maybe a short in-class essay, journal response, discussion project, because it is complicated. I mean, historians are still asking and debating that question.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are, I mean, it's a great strategy, and it's a great way to invite students to draw on what they've learned over the course of a course to think about what are the metrics, for lack of a better word, they want to use to think about success and failure. But I also think it connects to that kind of historical memory piece, the idea that sometimes the failure narrative troubles me because of the passivity kind of built into it, that implies that it's like if only the constitutional amendments had been better crafted, or it can kind of anchor the power and the story of historical change in the document of the Constitution, it feels like sometimes, in a way that I think really doesn't comport with what we know about the complex dynamics that have just been discussed even in this past hour. So I think I try to invite students to think about also thinking about agency as not just the thing of the people we like, but agency are the actions of people who undermine what we might think of as progressive change. So thinking about who sets out to diminish the potential of Reconstruction legislation to have as broad a transformative effect as we like to imagine it could have. So I'd like to think about the agency story here as a really complex one, and that failure can sometimes gloss over it. So that's another piece for me in my classes.
Yeah, rather than kind of saying, was it a failure? There's also the angle of like, when I have to talk about the extremely violent and massive white resistance to it, why was there so much resistance to it? So it was working. It was working really well. So well that the status quo was changed in the South. And to reestablish the status quo, look what they had to do in order to do that. So I don't think it necessarily changes whether it's like a failure or not, but like to instead focus on like, look at this moment and look what they had to do to defeat it, since I'm talking about them defeating it. For just the AP question, just real quick, I didn't want to leave you hanging. I actually start my kind of Reconstruction talk to give me more time as an I do all of the Civil War chronologically, and then I do Civil War as emancipation. And so like military Reconstruction, and like start with Port Royal and things like that, and move through it that way. And so because some places start to be effectively reconstructed before others. And then I do spend like a pretty good amount of time on memory. And yeah, you can do this for your survey class. In teaching about memory and assigning Du Bois, you can talk to them about historiography without knowing that they're talking about historiography.
Sure.
But yeah, just wanted to answer that question real quick. Sorry.
No, and I think I taught Civil War last semester, and at the end we were having this, the kind of like success failure is a kind of like perfect exam question to get them to weigh on and weight. And someone said, if you would have taken the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and showed them to Lincoln in 1860 or someone else in 1860, would they have thought that was a victory? Like, what would they have thought? Like, whether it's fully achieved or not, the idea that was even possible would have seemed like, I mean, there's a point where, there's always another question as to whether Lincoln would have been more or less, how aggressive he would have been to the South, or whether, I had a student argue, I think he would have thought that ending slavery was such a big achievement that was all he could have ever asked for, and would not have pushed as far as the radical Republican. I mean, these are questions you never can answer, but that question of success and failure really determines on what you can see. I think, as Melissa's right, what was actually the achievements that you have in the late 1860s and early 1870s, the 1871-72 election, showed that the possibilities might have been for sweeping change might have been even greater than you would have ever expected. And so that kind of raises that what could have been possible, and then what isn't achieved in, the kind of as it collapses in the late 1870s. So we are coming into the end of our hour. Thank you guys so much. Do you guys have if you have any final words to say as we close up? Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. If you have any closing words, we'd love to hear them. If not, then I think we can wrap up. But thank you guys so much.
Thank you, and thank you all for
organizing
attending.
it.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.